Hi, everyone. I'm going to give a short introduction to the book of Psalms. This is actually one of my favorite parts of the Bible. It's a long book. There's 150 Psalms, and many of them are beautiful. They're poetry. In this reading that you have, make sure you take a look at Psalm 23. The Lord's my shepherd, I shall not want. One of the most famous parts of the Bible, and a beautiful small poem about God's loving care. But let's think for a moment about where we are with the Psalms. So if you think of the Hebrew Bible as a story of God's working with his people of Israel, you've got some stages in that story. We begin with the creation of all human beings and the world, right? That was Genesis 1 through 10. Then we came and saw God beginning to work and create this people of promise. That's the story of Abraham, the father of that nation and that people. Move a little bit forward and we get to Moses, and this is the central event in the creation of this people, as it's presented in the Bible, is the calling of that people from the slavery of Egypt to the promised land. This place where the people would be nurtured and in this relationship with Yahweh, their God. Law was an important part of forming that people. It created differences between this people and the groups that are outside them. You know, if you read those passages in Exodus on the law, there's little things like if you build an altar, make sure it's not of dressed stone, and I mean, little things that don't seem to make any difference. But if you think about what those rules do, they create stylistic and aesthetic differences between the in-group, who are the people of Israel, the ancient people of Israel, and the other numerous people groups that are around them in the ancient world. All right. So that is an important part of law as well, is not just personal hygiene and personal health, but group, setting off the group as unique and obviously connected to each other. All right. So that's another reason for thinking about law and hygiene and what foods you can eat and what foods you can't eat. Those can be effective ways of building group cohesion. Now, time passes and Israel becomes a kingdom. And the famous king of Israel is David, and then his son Solomon. So at this point, we've moved from the desert and wandering in the desert and this kind of ancient, timeless past into something that becomes more historical, is that Israel was an ancient nation. Okay, and what came along with that was also a temple, which was in Jerusalem, and that was a place where there would be worship and where people would come from all over the small area of Israel to worship in the temple. And what comes with corporate worship is music and songs. And so that's what these psalms are, these are the songbook of ancient Israel. All right. Now, a lot of these are attributed to David. You'll see that in the heading of a lot of the Psalms of David, a Psalm of David. And so this King David is kind of notionally the author for many of the Psalms. And it's kind of popular in churches. You'll often hear these Psalms that accepted, and these Psalms connected to specific places in the life of David. And I would just kind of urge you to realize that these headers are not truly connected to the Psalms themselves. They were added. There's reasons to see that and understand how these things developed by people who were looking for ways to connect the biographical details of David's life to some of the details of the Psalms. But I think that gets us off on basically a rabbit trail of trying to understand the biography of David and the feelings of David through these Psalms, when they're meant instead for use by individuals in groups as they worship in the temple and as they go about their lives. We have a beautiful example of how the Psalms were used. If you look to the first 2 chapters of First Samuel, you'll see that there's this woman, Hannah, who is without child, and she prays to God, and finally she gets a child. You can read the story if you like, but then she stays behind in the temple and she prays this psalm. And the psalm contains words that you wouldn't necessarily associate with her situation. My heart exults in the Lord. My strength is exalted in my God. My mouth derides my enemies because I rejoice in my victory. So in other words, it's not a literal victory. She's not at war, but these are metaphors for understanding her triumph in this very personal matter through God's help, right? And so as you read these Psalms, realize that the metaphors shouldn't be taken literally. At the beginning of Psalm 3, for example, "O Lord, how many are my foes? Many are rising against me. Many are saying to me, there's no help for you in God. You, O Lord, are a shield." These aren't to be used in warfare. There's not literal enemies necessarily. This is about kind of ways of metaphors for thinking about lives and individual lives. And I would invite you to think of the Psalms a little bit more like Hallmark cards than like things that reflect moments in David's life, right? They are cards that contain very generic, broad language and metaphors that can be applied by individuals to different situations in their lives. Sometimes those are grief and lament. Sometimes those are happiness and peace and trust. There's a range of emotions that are reflected here, and that's because you would want different psalms for different times, right? That would reflect places where the community is at. And so I believe that's the way we should take and read the Psalms. Let me just look at a couple of different elements of the Psalms that in the group that you're going to be reading, Psalm 1 to 23. Psalm 1, for example, is actually not a psalm, not something that was ever sung in the temple or anything like that, but rather is the introduction to the Psalms. It's a little wisdom verse, wisdom chapter, I should say. "Happy are those who do not follow the advice of the wicked, or take the path that sinners tread, or sit in the seat of scoffers, but their delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law they meditate day and night. They are like trees planted by streams of water, which yield their fruit in its season, and their leaves do not wither. In all that they do, they prosper. The wicked are not so, but are like chaff that the wind drives away. Therefore the wicked will not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. For the Lord watches over the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish." And so this is, kind of a pious idea that there are these two paths. There's the path of the righteous, and there's the path of the wicked. God will make to prosper the path of the righteous, and he will bring down the path of the wicked. And there's a lot in the Psalms that basically reflect that point of view. God blesses those who are righteous, and he judges those who are wicked. And I guess I would like to invite you to think of that not necessarily as literally what happens, but that one of the things that the Psalms are doing is kind of presenting in broad strokes that God helps the good and tears down the wicked. There are other places in the Bible, the book of Job, the prophets, where the Bible really wrestles with why do bad things happen to good people, and that kind of a question. But the Psalms, these corporate expressions of trust and faith in God, aren't the place for dealing with the niceties of human experience and why things don't always seem to work out right. Instead, they're presenting the kind of majority view, the what would you say, the standard communal view about what God does and who he rewards and who he punishes. So you don't see in the Psalms a kind of like singer-songwriter wrestling with the particularities of life so much as these very broad frames for understanding life. Now, the other thing is God judges the wicked, and he uh, gives prosperity to the righteous. What does that mean? Often, I think we jump way too quickly to thinking about an afterlife. That this is, the good will get heaven, the bad will get hell. But that's not present in the Psalms. You can't read that kind of afterlife mechanism. What's always being talked about in the Psalms is this life. God does his blessing in this life, and he does his judging in this life. And if there's actually not a very firm or strong conception of the afterlife anywhere, let me just find my with the idea of Sheol, and I've lost it all. Oh yeah. This is on Psalm 6, verse 4 and 5. Turn, O Lord, save my life. Deliver me for the sake of your steadfast love. For in death there is no remembrance of you. In Sheol, who can give you praise? All right, so like a lot of cultures around the Mediterranean, there's a belief in some kind of a shadowy place where something about you may live after death. For the ancient Greeks, there was Hades. And then here we've got Sheol is the place that the Hebrew Bible talks about. And that's just a dark, not full life, that there's some kind of shadowy existence after life. And so the psalmist is saying, save my life, for in death I won't be able to praise you. When I'm in Sheol, I may have some kind of fleeting existence, but I won't be able to praise you anymore. So there's a this worldliness to the Psalms that we can often ignore, and instead we kind of apply our afterlife visions of heaven and hell to what's being talked about. Blessing will come in this life, cursing will come in this life. And if that is the expectation that is presented in the Psalms. We've talked a lot about community and the way the kind of basic conception, general conception of the order of existence is presented in places like Genesis 1. Well, you see those things presented in song. If you look at Psalm 8, and take some time. This isn't a long reading assignment, but take some time to read through these and think of them as poems. But in Psalm 8, you get this kind of creation of human beings. Verse 5, you've made them, human beings, a little lower than God and crowned them with glory and honor. You've given them dominion over the works of your hands. You put all things under their feet, etc., etc. And you'll recognize those themes from Genesis 1. So here is kind of another take on it. This is maybe something that people would hear and that would be repeated and in some way. So there's the general order of existence is being in these kind of corporate forms spread and communicated to worshipers. All right, so you get these things that are more elaborately told in the rest of the Hebrew Bible are come together and are presented in kind of short poetic forms. And that's something that communities do. I think if you go to churches, you'll hear music, right? Where there's in kind of these kind of seed form, you'll get some of the bigger themes that those churches will talk about in sermons or at length in books or whatever. But the music is ways to kind of really double down as a community on the principles and values that hold that community together. The one thing I don't want to miss before we leave is, and I end this video, is Psalm 18. This is a fascinating one for a number of reasons, but the thing that I love about it is the fact that it's clearly a cultural borrowing. If you look at Psalm 18, verses 7 and following, the earth reeled and rocked. The foundations of the mountains trembled and quaked because he, God, Yahweh, was angry. Smoke went up from his nostrils, devouring fire from his mouth. Glowing coals flamed forth from him. He bowed the heavens and came down. He bowed the heavens and came down. Thick darkness was under his feet. He rode on a cherub and flew. He came swiftly upon the wings of the wind. He made darkness his covering around him, his canopy thick clouds, dark with water. And this is This is a kind of poetry that we have represented now from elsewhere in this area. The Canaanite god of Baal was a storm god, and this is the kind of language that would be used by neighboring communities to talk about Baal. Now, I'm not saying there's anything wrong going on here, but this is a presentation of Yahweh with this kind of storm and cloud and earth trembling language that's borrowed from nearby cultures and their presentation of their God. Now, there's nothing wrong with doing that. There's a lot of cultural borrowing going on everywhere. But to realize that there's so much that's kind of inward looking that we get in the Bible. We are a unique, true community, but there are also these moments where there's a looking outside of that community to find effective language for talking about God that really emphasizes the awe and majesty of God. And here in 18, there's a clear sense of cultural borrowing and this very unique version of God approaching on the clouds and in the kinds of language and metaphors that were applied to the storm god Baal. All right, that's something I love. I love that about the Hebrew Bible, are those moments of kind of drawing from the outside for the way that God will be viewed and described. Okay, enjoy Psalm 1 to 23. And your assignment, this is very short. I just want you to raise a question or a comment about something that you find interesting in this Psalm reading, Psalm 1 to 23. We're going to have a chance to discuss these things, so you don't have to go on at length. I'm going to try to look at some of you have written and then call on you in our meetings. Okay, so I'll talk to you on Wednesday, and I look forward to being able to talk about one of my favorite parts of the Bible.